Margaret Hale was 38 years old when the county board declared her school unnecessary. The bank seized the little cottage she had spent 18 years paying for. The town council quietly agreed that she had become a burden no one wished to carry. And with only $2 folded inside the pocket of her faded wool coat, she made what everyone in the valley called the most foolish purchase they had ever seen, by buying an abandoned one-room schoolhouse at a tax auction on the edge of Willow Creek for exactly $2. The roof sagged beneath years of forgotten winters. The windows stared like empty eyes across fields overtaken by wild grass, and every sensible person believed the weather would finish destroying what time had already begun. Yet somewhere inside those weathered walls, sealed beyond ordinary sight, rested something patiently waiting through years of silence. Something that would answer the question she had carried in her heart since everything she loved had been taken away, and in answering it would quietly restore not only one forgotten woman, but an entire community that had almost forgotten itself. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Margaret Hale. If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, tell us about it in the comments, because forgotten places sometimes remember the greatest stories. We often imagine that remarkable lives begin with remarkable fortunes, but they seldom do. More often they begin with ordinary people who discover that steady hands, patient hearts, and honest work possess a strength that loud ambition can never imitate. Margaret Hale belonged to that quieter kind of soul. She was born during an early spring, when the hills surrounding Willow Creek still carried thin ribbons of melting snow. Her father, Thomas Hale, earned his living repairing wagons, sharpening tools, and mending nearly anything made of wood. There were no signs above his workshop, no painted advertisements, and no polished storefront to draw travelers from distant counties. Those who came found him because another neighbor had spoken his name with trust, and trust was worth more than any painted sign. Her mother, Eleanor, never considered herself educated in the grand sense admired by wealthy families back east. She could read every page of a newspaper, copy scripture in careful handwriting, and recite poems she had learned as a girl. Yet she often laughed that life itself had been her greatest teacher. She believed that every object deserved respect because someone had once sacrificed time to create it. Broken chairs became sturdy again beneath her hands. Torn dresses returned to usefulness through careful stitching. Empty flour sacks transformed into curtains, towels, and children's shirts. Margaret grew up believing nothing truly valuable should be wasted. Many evenings, she sat quietly beside her father's workbench while the smell of pine shavings drifted through the little workshop. Thomas rarely hurried. He examined every crack before choosing exactly where to place a new piece of timber. He would sometimes hand Margaret a damaged board and ask her what she noticed. She usually answered that it was cracked. He would smile. "No," he would say gently. "You noticed the wound. Look again until you notice what still remains." Only after several moments would she see the stronger grain hidden beneath the splintered surface. That lesson settled deep inside her long before she understood its meaning. When Margaret reached 12 years of age, a traveling school inspector visited Willow Creek and asked each child to read aloud. Most stumbled through the passage with nervous voices, but Margaret spoke each sentence with calm confidence, lingering over every word as though every line deserved kindness before being released into the room. The inspector remained silent after she finished. Then he looked toward her parents. This girl should teach someday. The suggestion seemed almost impossible. Teachers usually came from larger towns with families possessing means beyond anything the Hales had ever known. Yet Eleanor quietly squeezed her daughter's hand beneath the table. Then perhaps she will. Dreams often begin as simple permission. Years passed. Margaret studied every borrowed book she could find. Farmers lent her old almanacs. Traveling ministers left behind worn histories. Railway workers occasionally traded newspapers from distant cities for homemade bread. She read everything, not because examinations required it, but because every page expanded the world beyond Willow Creek's familiar hills. Eventually, she completed the examinations necessary to teach. Her assignment brought her nowhere grand. She received the one-room schoolhouse standing on the eastern edge of Willow Creek, where children ranging from 6 to 16 crowded together each morning carrying slate boards, patched books, and hopeful expressions. The building itself was plain, white paint peeled from weather-beaten boards. The bell rope frayed a little more every season. Winter winds found countless tiny openings between the timber walls. Yet Margaret loved the place immediately. She believed children deserved beauty even when surrounded by hardship. Fresh wildflowers appeared inside old jars each spring. Maps carefully drawn by hand decorated bare walls. She encouraged older pupils to help younger ones before helping themselves. Whenever families struggled through poor harvests, she quietly shared food from her own cupboard without announcing where it had come from. Children remembered such things far longer than arithmetic lessons. Parents noticed too. When storms flooded creeks, Margaret crossed fallen trees to reach isolated farms and carry lessons herself. When illness spread through neighboring valleys, she visited recovering children with books tucked beneath her arm so they would not fall behind. She accepted no extra payment. Service, in her understanding, did not require applause. Years became decades. Children she had once taught returned as grown mothers and fathers, bringing sons and daughters through the same familiar doorway. Many could scarcely remember learning to read. They remembered Margaret. They remembered how she never embarrassed slow learners. They remembered how she celebrated quiet progress instead of loud success. They remembered how every child, no matter how poor, received exactly the same welcome. One autumn afternoon, an elderly rancher arrived carrying a wooden box whose hinges had broken beyond use. He apologized for interrupting school. Margaret dismissed the children for their midday meal before helping examine the box. She recognized her father's lessons immediately. Instead of replacing the entire lid, she shaped one careful piece from leftover timber stored behind the stove. The repair became almost invisible. The rancher laughed softly. "You fix wood exactly the way you teach children." Margaret looked puzzled. "You don't throw away what's damaged," he explained. "You find what remains worth saving." Those words followed her for many years. Life appeared content without becoming wealthy. Her parents eventually passed away within 2 winters of one another, leaving no inheritance except their modest belongings, their workshop tools, and the values they had quietly planted inside their daughter. Margaret sold the workshop because maintaining both buildings proved impossible, but she kept her father's measuring square and her mother's sewing basket. Neither possessed much monetary value. To her, they contained entire lifetimes. She bought a tiny cottage near the schoolhouse, paying for it through years of careful saving. Every month, another small payment disappeared into the bank until ownership slowly became hers. She planted lilacs beneath the front window, apple trees behind the fence, climbing roses along the porch. Nothing about her home invited envy. Everything about it invited peace. Visitors often remarked that Margaret's house somehow felt warmer than larger homes filled with expensive furniture. Perhaps warmth has always depended more upon welcome than wealth. As Willow Creek slowly changed, the outside world arrived with increasing speed. Railway connections expanded commerce. Larger schools appeared in neighboring towns. County officials spoke enthusiastically about efficiency, consolidation, and modern administration. They admired numbers. Margaret admired names. To officials, 20 scattered pupils represented unnecessary expense. To Margaret, they represented 20 separate futures deserving equal care. She noticed subtle changes before anyone else admitted they existed. Letters requesting additional classroom supplies received shorter replies. Maintenance funds arrived later each year. The roof repair promised one autumn quietly disappeared from the following spring's budget. Traveling inspectors spent less time observing children than measuring the building itself. They carried ledgers thicker than storybooks. They asked questions about costs, more frequently than learning. One evening, she remained inside the classroom after sunset, correcting copybooks beneath the soft glow of an oil lamp while rain whispered steadily against the windows. The familiar room seemed unusually still. She looked around at the worn desks bearing generations of carved initials. Each scratch represented someone who had once believed tomorrow would arrive exactly as expected. She wondered whether buildings sensed approaching endings before people did. Outside, thunder rolled across distant hills. Inside, she carefully stacked every exercise book before extinguishing the lamp. She paused at the doorway. For reasons she could not explain, she rested one hand gently against the old wall beside the entrance. The timber felt cool beneath her fingertips, almost as though the building itself wished to remember being noticed. She smiled sadly before locking the door. Neither she nor anyone else walking home beneath that darkening sky could have imagined how swiftly familiar certainties were about to disappear, or how the quiet life Margaret Hale had patiently built over nearly 2 decades would begin slipping away one decision at a time, until even the little cottage with its lilacs and apple trees would no longer belong to her, leaving only 2 lonely dollars and a choice that every sensible neighbor would dismiss as the greatest mistake an already broken woman could possibly make. The autumn after that storm arrived with unusually early frost, whitening the meadows before sunrise and leaving every fence post sparkling beneath pale morning light. Willow Creek admired the beauty, yet beneath that quiet splendor another season had begun, one measured not by weather, but by official letters, public meetings, and careful conversations that always seemed to end before Margaret entered the room. The first notice arrived folded inside a plain government envelope. She recognized the county seal before breaking the wax. The language remained polite from beginning to end. It praised her years of faithful service, acknowledged her commitment to education, and explained that, after a thorough review, the Willow Creek School would close at the end of the term. All remaining pupils would be transported to the larger Consolidated Academy, nearly 12 miles away, where modern facilities and expanded resources promised a brighter future. The words thanked her. The words honored her. The words quietly erased her life's work. She read the letter 3 times before placing it carefully upon her desk. Outside, children laughed while chasing one another across the yard, unaware that their familiar mornings were already numbered. Margaret did not tell them immediately. She believed children deserved one more ordinary day. The announcement came a week later, during a gathering inside the schoolhouse itself. Parents filled every bench, while older pupils stood along the walls. The county superintendent spoke confidently about progress. He described larger classrooms, newer textbooks, trained specialists, and opportunities impossible within a single-room building. Everything he said sounded reasonable. Everything he said also carried the unspoken message that the old ways no longer mattered. Several parents nodded. Others stared quietly at the floor. No one argued for long. Hard years had taught farming families that decisions made in distant offices rarely changed because ordinary people objected. When the meeting ended, neighbors lingered outside beneath fading afternoon light. Many embraced Margaret. Some apologized, though none had caused the decision. An elderly widow wiped tears from her cheeks. "You taught every one of my children," she whispered. Margaret smiled gently. "And now they'll teach their own." The widow tried to answer but could not. Within weeks, the school began emptying itself in strange, quiet ways. Extra books disappeared into county wagons. Maps came down from the walls. The piano, old and slightly out of tune, was loaded onto a freight cart destined for another district. Even the bell was removed. The silence it left behind felt heavier than its sound had ever been. Margaret remained until the final afternoon. She swept the wooden floor one last time. She dusted every desk, although no child would sit there again. She straightened chairs that no longer needed straightening. Before locking the door, she stood in the center of the room where generations of young voices had once recited multiplication tables, poems, scripture, and dreams. The empty building seemed larger than she remembered. Perhaps loneliness always enlarges empty spaces. She whispered only 4 words. "Thank you for everything." Then she closed the door. Without the school, her salary disappeared. She possessed modest savings, enough to survive several months if she remained careful. She searched neighboring counties for another teaching position. Letters traveled west. Applications traveled east. Replies returned slowly. Some schools already employed teachers. Others preferred younger applicants trained under newer educational methods. A few never answered at all. Winter deepened. Her savings steadily shrank. She sold unnecessary furniture. The rocking chair her father had built remained. So did her mother's sewing basket. Everything else became negotiable. The grocer quietly extended credit. The pharmacist accepted delayed payment. Neighbors shared vegetables without mentioning charity. Margaret accepted every kindness with gratitude and every disappointment with dignity. She refused to surrender hope simply because circumstances had changed. Then spring brought the second blow. The bank manager visited personally. Mr. Edwin Potter had known Margaret for years. His expression revealed the news before he spoke. The economic troubles spreading across nearby counties had reached Willow Creek. Several investments supporting the local bank had failed. Policies once flexible had become painfully strict. Margaret had fallen behind on the final payments for her cottage. Only 3 remained. 3. After 18 years, Potter removed his spectacles. "I tried." She believed him. "I know. The directors won't allow further extensions." She nodded without anger. "What happens now?" His voice almost disappeared. "The property must be surrendered." Neither spoke for several moments. Outside the open window, robins sang as though spring had arrived exactly as expected. Inside, another kind of season ended. Margaret packed her belongings carefully over the following week, not because she possessed many things, because every object deserved respect before farewell. She wrapped dishes individually, folded blankets neatly, polished her father's measuring square before placing it inside a wooden box. She lingered longest beside the lilacs blooming beneath the porch. They had finally reached the height she once imagined. Someone else would enjoy their fragrance. She hoped they would notice. On her final evening, she left the cottage cleaner than when she had first entered years before. Loss never gave her permission to abandon her standards. She locked the front door, placed the key beneath the flower pot exactly where instructed, walked away carrying 2 small cases. She never looked back. Not because she lacked affection, because she feared she might never continue walking if she did. For several weeks, she rented a tiny room above the blacksmith's stable. The ceiling leaked whenever heavy rain fell. The mattress sagged. The walls remained thin enough for every conversation downstairs to drift upward at night. Still, it sheltered her. She remained thankful. By midsummer, however, even that arrangement became impossible. Her savings had dwindled until only 2 worn silver dollars remained. $2. That was everything separating her from complete uncertainty. People noticed. Small towns always notice. Some pitied her sincerely. Others quietly wondered whether stubborn pride had prevented her from leaving Willow Creek months earlier. A merchant suggested she move to the city and seek domestic work. Another recommended living with distant relatives. Margaret thanked them kindly. Yet something inside her resisted abandoning the valley that had shaped every meaningful chapter of her life. She walked often beyond the edge of town, where abandoned buildings slowly surrendered themselves to weeds and weather. One afternoon, she reached the old schoolhouse. Months had already altered it. Tall grass surrounded the steps. One shutter hung crookedly from rusted hinges. Dust coated the windows so heavily that sunlight scarcely entered. The county had no further use for it. Children no longer laughed there. Travelers scarcely noticed it. Margaret rested one hand against the familiar doorway. "I suppose we're both unemployed now," she murmured. The building answered only with quiet wind moving through broken eaves. Several days later, word spread that unwanted county properties would be sold during a small tax auction. Few attended. Most items held little value. Collapsed sheds, neglected storage buildings, unused parcels of rocky land. The old schoolhouse appeared near the end of the list. The auctioneer glanced across the modest crowd. Opening bid, $2. Silence. Someone chuckled. Another man muttered that the timber was hardly worth hauling away. The roof alone would cost more than rebuilding from scratch. Rain leaked through half the ceiling. Mice probably owned the place already. The auctioneer sighed. $2? Margaret looked down at the 2 coins resting inside her gloved hand. Buying the building would leave her with nothing. Absolutely nothing. No reserve, no safety, no certainty about tomorrow. Reason whispered that she should keep the money for food. Memory whispered something else. She remembered frightened children arriving during blizzards, harvest celebrations, Christmas recitals, tiny hands proudly writing their names for the first time. She remembered every hope that little room had sheltered. Before doubt could silence her, she quietly raised her hand. "I'll take it." Heads turned. Several neighbors exchanged puzzled glances. The auctioneer almost smiled with relief. Sold. The hammer struck once. Just like that, Margaret Hale became the owner of an abandoned schoolhouse everyone else believed beyond saving. As the small crowd dispersed, one farmer caught up with her. "Margaret," he said carefully, "what will you do with it?" She looked toward the lonely building standing against the distant hills. "I don't know. You've spent every penny." "I know. It may fall down before winter." She smiled. "Then at least it'll belong to someone who remembers what it once was." The farmer shook his head gently, unable to decide whether she possessed remarkable courage or astonishing foolishness. Perhaps the difference between those 2 qualities only becomes clear many years later. Margaret received a heavy iron key that afternoon. The metal felt colder than she expected. She walked alone toward the schoolhouse while long shadows stretched across the fields. Unlocking the familiar door felt strangely different. For years she had entered as caretaker. Now, she entered as owner. The hinges protested with a tired groan. Dust drifted lazily through slanting sunlight. Everything smelled of dry timber, forgotten paper, and seasons left undisturbed. The empty room greeted her almost shyly. Several desks remained because moving them had cost more than their value. The blackboard still covered the front wall, though faded chalk lines lingered like faint memories refusing to disappear. She removed her coat, opened every surviving window. Fresh summer air slowly chased away months of stale silence. Without thinking, she reached for the old broom, leaning exactly where she had left it on the final day. Its handle had cracked slightly. Still, it served. She swept patiently. Dust rolled toward the open doorway in pale clouds. Broken glass filled one bucket. Hours slipped quietly away. By sunset, the room looked less abandoned. Not restored. Simply remembered. She smiled for the first time in many weeks. As darkness approached, she decided to inspect the little storage room behind the classroom, where old teaching supplies had once been kept. The narrow door resisted. Moisture had swollen the wood. After several determined pushes, it finally yielded with a sharp crack. Shelves lined the walls. Most stood empty. A few broken slates lay scattered across the floor, beside rusted ink bottles and cracked wooden rulers. Margaret picked through the forgotten items slowly, wondering whether anything remained useful. An old lantern, a bundle of yellowed attendance sheets, several worn spelling books whose pages had curled with age. Then, while moving a warped cupboard away from the back wall, she heard something that stopped her completely. Not the dull scrape of wood against floorboards. Something hollow, a short, unmistakable echo. She frowned. The wall behind the cupboard should have been solid. She tapped it gently with her knuckles. Again came the same hollow sound. She leaned closer. One narrow section of the timber looked almost identical to the surrounding boards, yet the grain flowed differently, as though someone long ago had fitted another panel with extraordinary care. There were no visible hinges, no handle, only a faint hairline seam nearly hidden beneath layers of old paint, so subtle that years of daily teaching had never drawn her attention to it. Margaret rested her fingertips against the strange panel. The timber felt unexpectedly smooth, almost as though another pair of hands had once polished it again and again before carefully hiding it from every passing eye, leaving behind a silence that had patiently guarded its secret through decades, waiting for the one person who would notice that sometimes the greatest discoveries begin with nothing more than listening to a wall everyone else believed was perfectly ordinary. Margaret did not try to force the panel open that evening. She had learned long ago that impatience often damaged the very things a careful heart hoped to preserve. Instead, she knelt beside the strange section of wall, while the last light of day stretched across the empty classroom, tracing long golden lines over worn floorboards that had carried generations of small boots. Her fingertips followed the narrow seam again, searching for the smallest difference in texture. Someone had built this deliberately, not to strengthen the wall, to hide something. The thought settled quietly inside her. The schoolhouse had stood for more than 40 years. Dozens of teachers had worked within these walls. Hundreds of children had filled the room with laughter, arguments, recitations, and dreams. If the hidden space had remained unnoticed through all those years, then whoever concealed it had possessed remarkable skill. Darkness finally persuaded her to stop. She lit the old lantern she had found in the storage room and spread her blanket across one corner of the classroom. Owning the building did not mean she possessed another place to sleep, and though the roof admitted the occasional drip from old storms, it remained drier than the room above the blacksmith's stable. That first night inside her purchased schoolhouse felt strangely peaceful. The wind sighed through loose boards overhead. Crickets sang beyond broken windows. The building settled with soft creaks, as though stretching tired bones after months of loneliness. Margaret lay awake looking into darkness. Not once did she think about treasure. She thought instead about questions. Who had hidden that panel? Why had no record mentioned it? Why would anyone conceal something inside a school rather than a bank, a church, or a private home? Questions, she believed, often proved richer than quick answers. At first light, she borrowed a small toolbox from Mr. Gideon Marsh, the elderly carpenter who still repaired barns despite aching knees. He watched her choose a narrow chisel, a wooden mallet, and a thin pry knife. Planning repairs already? I hope so. On that old schoolhouse? She smiled. It deserves another chance. He nodded thoughtfully. So do most things. He refused payment for the borrowed tools. You can return them whenever you're finished. Back inside the storage room, Margaret worked with extraordinary care. The old paint around the seam had hardened almost like stone, yet after nearly an hour of patient scraping, a tiny opening appeared near one corner. She inserted the thin blade gently. Nothing moved. She tried another point. Still nothing. Then, almost by accident, her thumb pressed against what appeared to be an ordinary knot in the timber. A soft click answered. The panel shifted scarcely half an inch. Margaret stopped breathing. The hidden door had not swollen shut after all. It had been locked. Very slowly she eased the narrow panel outward. Dust drifted into the air. A shallow compartment, no deeper than her forearm, waited silently inside the wall. It was empty, or so it appeared. Disappointment flickered across her face before she noticed something resting along the bottom. Not a box, not coins. A single oilcloth bundle, wrapped carefully and tied with faded blue ribbon. She lifted it gently. The fabric remained dry despite the passing decades. Someone had taken great care to protect whatever rested inside. Margaret carried the bundle into the classroom, where sunlight filled the room. The ribbon crumbled almost immediately beneath her fingers. Inside lay 3 objects. The first was a leather-bound ledger, its cover darkened with age but surprisingly well preserved. The second was a packet of sealed letters, each tied together with faded string. The third was a folded sheet of thick parchment unlike any paper she had ever handled. She opened the ledger first. The front page bore a name written in elegant script, Nathaniel Ashcombe. Below it, another line appeared. Founder, Willow Creek Academy. Margaret frowned. She knew every story commonly told about the valley. Children learned that Willow Creek's first school had been built by county funds after determined local effort. No one had ever mentioned Nathaniel Ashcombe. She turned another page. Instead of classroom accounts, she found detailed records of donations. Lumber, stone, glass, nails, food for workers, books purchased from distant publishers. Every item carefully listed. Beside nearly every donation appeared a different family name. Many still lived in Willow Creek. Others belonged to families long gone. Margaret recognized grandparents, great-grandparents, and pioneers whose names decorated weathered gravestones overlooking the valley. This was no private record. It was the story of how the entire community had built the school together. Why had it been hidden? She carefully unfolded the parchment. It proved to be a hand-drawn map of Willow Creek, as it had existed decades earlier. Several familiar landmarks appeared. The church, the creek, the mill, the original wagon road. Near the edge, someone had drawn a broad section of land outlined in dark ink. Across it appeared a simple note, held in perpetual trust for the education of every child within Willow Creek Valley. Margaret read the sentence twice, then 3 times. She looked back toward the ledger. A trust, land, education. None of it matched the official history she had always believed. Her attention turned toward the packet of letters. Unlike the ledger, these had never been opened since being tied together. The first envelope bore no address, only one instruction. To the first person who finds this after we are gone. Margaret hesitated. Reading another person's private correspondence felt almost improper. Yet whoever had hidden these pages had clearly intended someone to discover them someday. With gentle care, she unfolded the letter. The handwriting matched the ledger. If these words are being read, then enough years have passed for pride to cool and truth to become more useful than reputation. We built this school together because no child should inherit ignorance simply because their family owns little. Wealth may purchase comfort, but knowledge belongs equally to every honest soul willing to seek it. Margaret smiled softly. She continued reading. Certain men believed education should remain under the control of those possessing property. They feared that ordinary families, once educated, would ask difficult questions concerning land, taxes, and promises. They sought ownership where we intended stewardship. Her smile faded. The letter continued. Should our trust ever disappear from public record, know that it existed. Know that every acre listed upon the enclosed map was donated freely by farmers, ranchers, merchants, and widows who gave according to their means. No single family owns what an entire community sacrificed to create. Margaret slowly lowered the page. The trust had disappeared. No one living mentioned it. How? She searched hurriedly through later entries in the ledger. Near the back, she discovered additional notes written in shakier handwriting. Several county officials had disputed the arrangement. Court filings had begun. Certain records had gone missing. Nathaniel feared deliberate interference. One final sentence appeared beneath the last dated entry. If honesty sleeps for a generation, let whoever wakes it remember that this land was never meant to enrich individuals. It belongs to the children. Nothing more. The remaining pages stood blank. Margaret sat motionless for a long while. Outside, afternoon sunlight rippled through tall grass. Inside, 40 years of accepted history quietly shifted beneath her understanding. Late that afternoon, she carried the documents carefully wrapped inside fresh cloth to the Willow Creek Public Reading Room, where Mrs. Lydia Barnes served as both librarian and unofficial town historian. Lydia adjusted her spectacles while examining the ledger. I've never seen this name before. Neither had I. She studied several pages carefully. These signatures are genuine. You recognize them. I recognize the handwriting of old Reverend Collins. His journals are upstairs. Lydia climbed a narrow ladder and returned carrying a faded journal. After several moments, she placed both pages side by side. The signatures match. Margaret felt her heartbeat quicken. So the ledger is authentic. It certainly appears to be. Lydia opened another volume containing early county records. Something immediately troubled her. Look here. Margaret leaned closer. The earliest public survey showed only a tiny school parcel. Nothing resembling the much larger trust marked upon Nathaniel's map. It was altered, Lydia whispered, or replaced. The two women spent hours comparing records. Some details aligned perfectly. Others contradicted one another in quiet but unmistakable ways. Dates shifted. Property lines changed. Entire names vanished between older church records and newer county books. Not dozens, only a carefully chosen few. Almost as though someone had rewritten history with remarkable precision. Evening shadows lengthened across the reading room. Lydia finally closed the final volume. Margaret? Yes? If this is true, she looked toward the old ledger. Then someone benefited greatly. Neither woman needed to say more. Land represented wealth. Wealth shaped influence. Influence often protected itself. Margaret wrapped the documents once more. I should report this. Lydia nodded slowly. To whom? The question lingered heavily between them. The county offices responsible for preserving records possessed the very documents now appearing incomplete. If mistakes had been accidental, the truth deserved restoration. If they had not. Margaret suddenly understood why Nathaniel Ashcombe had hidden everything instead of leaving it inside ordinary files. He had expected someone to erase more than paper. He had expected memory itself to become vulnerable. That night, she returned to the schoolhouse, carrying the ledger, letters, and map beneath her arm. She placed them carefully upon the teacher's old desk. The room no longer felt abandoned. It felt entrusted. Long after darkness settled over Willow Creek, Margaret read every surviving page again, discovering small details she had overlooked before. Beside many donations appeared tiny initials. At first, they seemed insignificant. Then she realized each matched one of several numbered locations marked upon the map. Curious, she spread the parchment beneath the lantern. The numbers formed no obvious pattern, until she traced them in order. Instead of outlining property, they connected like points in a child's drawing. The final line stopped at one particular corner of the trust land, where Nathaniel had written only 3 almost invisible words squeezed between contour marks. Begin where children gather. Margaret looked slowly around the empty classroom. Where children gather. The words did not point away from the schoolhouse. They pointed back to it. The hidden compartment had not contained the entire secret. It had contained only the first key, quietly suggesting that somewhere within the very building everyone had abandoned still rested another truth waiting patiently beneath years of dust, hidden so cleverly that even after 18 years of teaching within those walls, Margaret Hale had walked past it thousands of times without ever suspecting that the school itself had been built not merely to educate a community, but to guard the final piece of a promise that someone powerful had spent decades trying to make the world forget. Margaret scarcely slept before dawn. The lantern had long since burned low. Yet her thoughts refused to rest. Nathaniel Ashcombe had hidden the ledger, the letters, and the map, because he believed truth might someday need protecting. If that were true, then simply possessing those papers, placed a responsibility upon her shoulders that she had never sought. She was no lawyer. She was no politician. She had been a school teacher. School teachers solved disagreements over shared pencils, comforted frightened children, and reminded young minds that honesty mattered, even when no reward followed. They did not expose forgotten histories that reached into the affairs of county offices. Even so, morning found her carrying the bundle once again to Lydia Barnes. Together they decided that the evidence deserved examination beyond Willow Creek. Lydia wrote to the state archives, requesting that historians compare Nathaniel's ledger with early territorial records preserved elsewhere. Margaret enclosed careful copies rather than the originals, unwilling to let the documents leave her sight until their importance had been confirmed. The waiting proved difficult. News travels through small towns with remarkable speed, especially when no one knows the entire story. People notice strangers visiting the abandoned schoolhouse. They noticed Margaret measuring walls and floorboards with her father's old square. They noticed Lydia spending long evenings surrounded by ancient record books. Questions multiplied. Answers remained few. Within a fortnight, the county commissioner, Horace Bellamy, appeared at the schoolhouse accompanied by 2 clerks. Bellamy spoke politely. He always had. His coat was neatly pressed despite the dusty road, and his smile suggested concern more than authority. "We've heard you've uncovered some old papers." Margaret nodded. "I have. Historic curiosities are always interesting. They're more than curiosities. So I've been told." His eyes drifted slowly around the room. "This building belongs to county records now." Margaret quietly produced the deed from the auction. "I purchased it lawfully." He accepted the correction without argument. "Of course. Still, official documents should probably remain with the county. When historians have examined them." His pleasant expression cooled almost imperceptibly. "You distrust the county. I trust truth." For several moments, neither spoke. Then Bellamy adjusted his gloves. "Old records often create confusion where none is necessary." Margaret answered gently. "Sometimes they remove confusion." He departed courteously enough, but the warmth had vanished from his voice. The following week brought unexpected difficulties. A notice appeared claiming the schoolhouse violated current safety standards and might require demolition before winter. Another letter questioned whether the tax auction itself had been conducted properly. Rumors spread that Margaret hoped to enrich herself by inventing stories about hidden fortunes. Some neighbors who had once greeted her warmly now watched from a distance, not because they believed she had lied, because uncertainty unsettled them. One afternoon, the merchant who had previously advised her to leave Willow Creek approached quietly outside the general store. "People are talking. They usually do. They say there's treasure hidden somewhere." Margaret smiled sadly. "If there is, it doesn't belong to me." He studied her face. "I believe you." She thanked him. Belief, she knew, often arrived one person at a time. 3 weeks later, a reply finally came from the state archives. Lydia insisted they open it together. The letter was brief but astonishing. The handwriting in Nathaniel's ledger matched authenticated territorial records. Several signatures belonged to documented founders of Willow Creek. Most remarkable of all, archived survey notes in the state capitol referred to an educational land trust whose supporting paperwork had disappeared before final registration. The trust had existed. The state possessed fragments proving it. Margaret read the final paragraph twice. The historian requested immediate examination of the original documents because they appeared capable of restoring a forgotten public trust. The room fell silent. Lydia slowly removed her spectacles. "You were never chasing treasure." "No, you were chasing memory." Margaret folded the letter carefully. "No, memory found me." Within days, 2 historians and a surveyor arrived from the state capitol. Unlike curious townsfolk, they examined everything with disciplined patience. The hidden compartment. Nathaniel's ledger. The letters. The map. Finally, they followed the old survey markings beyond the schoolhouse into overgrown fields that most people believed belonged to scattered private holdings. The measurements continued for hours. By sunset, the surveyor lowered his instruments. The map is accurate. Several property boundaries recorded decades earlier had indeed been altered. Not dramatically. Only enough to absorb the educational trust into neighboring estates through a succession of convenient revisions. No living owner had committed the deception. The changes reached back long before anyone presently alive held office. Yet the consequences remained. Nearly 100 acres originally donated for the education of Willow Creek's children had quietly vanished from public purpose. Commissioner Bellamy attended the public meeting that followed. So did nearly every resident. The church overflowed. Farmers stood beside merchants. Former pupils filled every aisle. Margaret sat quietly near the back, wishing almost desperately that someone else would speak. Instead, the lead historian addressed the gathering. He explained the evidence calmly. No accusations. No dramatic speeches. Only facts supported by records. Nathaniel Ashcombe's trust had been genuine. The land had never been intended for private profit. Legal errors and missing documentation had buried its purpose over generations. Current law, however, permitted restoration when sufficient evidence appeared. Murmurs swept the room. One elderly rancher slowly rose. "My grandfather's name is in that ledger." Another woman stood. "So is my grandmother's." One by one, families recognized the sacrifices their ancestors had made. Not for themselves, for children they would never meet. Commissioner Bellamy also stood. Many expected denial. Instead, he removed his spectacles much as Mr. Potter once had. "My office inherited these records," he said quietly. "We did not create the mistakes." He paused. "But we are responsible for correcting them." The words surprised everyone, especially Margaret. Bellamy continued. "The county will cooperate fully. There would be no villain led away in disgrace. No angry confrontation. Instead, quiet justice unfolded exactly as truth often prefers." The altered records were corrected. Legal proceedings restored the trust. Families occupying affected land were not cruelly displaced, for most had purchased their property honestly, without knowledge of its history. Instead, agreements were reached. Compensation came through fair exchanges, voluntary easements, and county appropriations supported by the restored trust itself. It required patience. It required generosity. Above all, it required neighbors choosing restoration over resentment. Months passed. The neglected acreage began producing modest lease income dedicated entirely to education, exactly as Nathaniel had intended. Scholarships were created for children whose families struggled. Books arrived that no teacher needed to purchase with personal savings. A small library opened beside the church. Traveling instructors visited each season. Most remarkable of all, the old schoolhouse was repaired rather than demolished. Carpenters donated labor. Farmers supplied timber. Blacksmiths forged new hinges. Women stitched curtains. Children painted benches. No one received grand payment. Everyone received the satisfaction of restoring something worthy. When asked what purpose the building should now serve, the town looked naturally toward Margaret. She accepted only one condition: it must always remain open. So it became more than a school. During weekdays, children gathered there for reading and lessons. Evenings welcomed adults learning arithmetic, bookkeeping, and writing. Winter nights brought community meetings. Travelers found shelves of books waiting beside the fireplace. The building, once abandoned for $2, became the heart of Willow Creek once again. Margaret never claimed an office larger than the little teacher's desk she had used years before. She refused every suggestion that the restored trust bear her name. "It already has a name," she would say. The children. As for her own circumstances, the town quietly insisted upon restoring more than the schoolhouse. The little cottage with the lilacs had come onto the market after its owners decided to move west. Former pupils pooled their savings. The bank, ashamed of how events had unfolded despite acting within the rules of the time, forgave what little remained. One spring afternoon, Mr. Potter placed a familiar key into Margaret's hand. "It seems this belongs to you again." She could not speak. The lilacs still bloomed. The apple trees had grown taller. Someone had cared for the roses. She walked slowly through every room. Nothing felt exactly as before, nor should it. Homes, like hearts, become deeper after sorrow has passed through them. Years later, visitors often asked how Willow Creek had preserved such an unusual schoolhouse. The townspeople rarely began with discussions of hidden compartments or forgotten maps. They began with Margaret. They told of the woman who lost her position, her home, and nearly every possession she owned, yet still spent her final $2 rescuing a building everyone else believed worthless. Because she did, an entire community recovered something far greater than land. It recovered its own character. We began by telling you that Margaret Hale was 38 years old when she lost almost everything that seemed to define her life. That part was true. She lost her work. She lost her cottage. She stood with only $2 and purchased a crumbling schoolhouse that wiser people dismissed as a foolish burden. Yet the truest measure of a life is rarely found in what disappears. It is found in what remains after loss has stripped away every comfort. What remained in Margaret was patience learned beside her father's workbench, where damaged wood still held strong grain beneath its cracks. What remained was her mother's belief that nothing created with love should be discarded simply because it had grown worn. What remained was the quiet habit of seeing possibility where others noticed only ruin. That is why she heard a hollow sound in an ordinary wall. That is why she opened a forgotten compartment. That is why she recognized that the greatest discovery hidden inside the schoolhouse was never wealth waiting for one lonely woman. It was hope waiting for an entire valley. Nathaniel Ashcombe had protected a promise. Margaret fulfilled it. Neither sought applause. Both understood that the finest legacies often belong to people whose names appear only in old ledgers, remembered because they chose service over recognition. And perhaps that is why Willow Creek never again referred to the schoolhouse as abandoned. From then onward, it was simply known as the Old School, spoken with affection rather than pity, standing quietly against the hills as living proof that forgotten places sometimes guard the future, until someone humble enough arrives to listen. Thank you for spending this time with us and walking beside Margaret Hale through her remarkable journey. If her story stayed with you, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need the reminder that what the world overlooks can still hold extraordinary worth. Before you go, tell us in the comments, what is a time you found value in something others had completely written off? We always enjoy reading your stories. Until next time, stay close.